Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share a comparison between the Sony A7R Mark III on the left, priced at $3,200 US, with the RX10 Mark IV. Now, of course, the Mark IV is a cyber shot, a consumer bridge-style camera with a 1-inch sensor and a fixed piece of Carl Zeiss glass, 24 to 600 millimeters. The A7R Mark III, on the other hand, a full-frame 40-plus megapixel monster with 5-axis image stabilization, dual SD card slot bay right here, a new superior battery type, the same one used with the A9, nuances like touchscreen capabilities, a relocation of the video button, a real revamp of the A7R Mark II's body style in terms of making it more robust, and also a bevy of I/O ports that simply don't exist or didn't exist in Sony's full-frame mirrorless lineup. And that's USB Type-C, HDMI clean out was already there. You have flash sync, microphone, headphone jack, and of course the good old micro USB, aka multi-port. The RX10 Mark IV, on the other hand, even though both of these cameras have Wi-Fi and NFC, does not have that far a range of I/O ports. First of all, single SD card slot right here. You're not getting a dual. You also aren't getting that new Type-Z battery. You're going with the old traditional W battery, which you are going to feel. There is no joystick for selecting your spot focus, so that should be pointed out. It does similarly have the video button right here to the right of the center-mounted EVF, which I like. But the I/O ports, as I mentioned earlier, microphone, headphone jack, multi-port, and HDMI. That is it. This is a run-and-gun style bridge camera. The A7R Mark III, of course, the other end of the spectrum, the body for the professional that has the budget, has the means, and the intent to use all the different lenses they plan on putting into their workflow for whatever style of photography they actually are involved in. And of course, the fact that we've got a 1-inch sensor in here as opposed to a full frame does make a considerable difference, dynamic range, actual information that the sensor is able to capture in the A7R Mark III. I mean, if we just compare these on sensor alone, of course, the full frame sensor in the A7R Mark III just takes a straight dump on the 1-inch sensor in the RX10 Mark IV. But this video is more about convenience and performance. And that's because even though the sensor is much smaller in the RX10 Mark IV and we don't have 5-axis image stabilization like we do in the A7R Mark III, we do have the convenience of having one of the best fixed lenses that money can buy. And that's why the RX10 Mark IV is $1,700. Another thing I want to talk about is autofocus, because on both of these cameras you have some real, I would say, guts when it comes to autofocus. Now, the A7R Mark III's big improvement over the Mark II, besides the things I've mentioned, the pro-grade features, the battery life, the dual SD card slots, a bump up in the resolution of the EVF, which is higher res than the same OLED style EVF you get with the RX10 Mark IV. It is more so about convenience and how much you would have to spend on the lenses for the A7R Mark III in order to get the same flexibility and range that the RX10 Mark IV offers straight out of the box. And of course, with the Mark IV, you don't have an upgrade path, which is both a good and a bad thing. It's a great thing for those of you out there that aren't looking to empty a bank account in order to get your latest and greatest gear. And you've got everything you need in one single package. You have a flash on board here also, no flash with the A7R Mark III, another sign of who Sony is really touting or, marketing each camera to. Again, very clear this is more of a consumer-oriented base, and this is more of a professional customer or consumer base. And price does also reflect that. $3,200 for a body, $1,700 for a full camera. that, again, you're not going to need to do much in the way of accessories other than pick up more of the Type W batteries that it leans on. Now, the Type Z that the A7R Mark III has does yield a lot more battery life, more than twice the battery life you'll find with the W. Neither of these cameras have any overheating issues. When it comes, though, back to the autofocus that I was mentioning earlier, that's where things are fairly similar. Of course, the A7R Mark III is inherently better, but they're close. And that's why I wanted to compare this, because also in my use, since I've had the A7R Mark III in my hands, I found several instances where, I was reminded of why I love the RX10 Mark IV, as much as I know the A7R Mark III is the best camera, hands down, on the market. And essentially, before I get to that, the autofocus. So here we have 399 points of phase detection on sensor. So a little under 70% of the sensor has phase detection. Of course, it has, contrast points as well. The RX10 Mark IV, the big upgrade that was made with this camera as opposed to the previous gen RX10 Mark III, is that they finally brought a hybrid autofocus system, much like we have in the A7R Mark III, to a fixed lens cybershot. This was something Sony began with the RX100 Mark V. We don't have an RX100 Mark VI yet. Don't ask me why. Maybe I'll do a video about that, because it's definitely late, and more than fashionably late, to the party. But that's what's critical here with the RX10 Mark IV. You have 315 points as opposed to the 399, and yes, the sensors are not in the same universe. However, that does mean that you have a competent autofocus system to complement this fabulous, and it is a fabulous, fixed lens that they've attached to this body. It really performs incredibly well, and there's so many instances where I show people shots from this camera and they wonder if I was using a prime lens, and when I tell them it came out of a CyberShot bridge style camera that doesn't even have an interchangeable lens option, they are in shock. And that's the beauty of the RX10 Mark IV, beyond its general flexibility and convenience. So wanted to point that out, and part of that autofocus, 10 frames per second here, 24 frames per second with the RX10 Mark IV. Now, of course, the 24 sounds like a lot compared to the 10 you're getting with the A7R Mark III, but the autofocus on the Mark III is fairly, or I should say, quite significant in terms of performance, because even though on paper they sound like they're close, in real-world performance, the number of keepers and the tracking and overall capability of the A7R Mark III, in spite of what appears to be a small gap in the number of phase detection points, again, 399 versus 315, results to far more keepers, much better tracking here with the A7R Mark III. And you'd expect that. I mean, it's a $3,200 body. This is a $1,700 consumer-grade camera. But there's a lot to like about this. And getting back to one instance recently where I was shooting, I was out basically trying to do some birds in flight, which both of these cameras are great for. I found myself, of course, having to do what you have to do with any interchangeable lens camera, which is bring a bunch of lenses with you. Swap those lenses out. A lot more weight with the A7R Mark III than with the RX10 Mark IV. So that's part of the convenience. And I knew that if I had the RX10 Mark IV rather than the A7R Mark III, I probably would have been finding subjects much more quickly. Now, does that mean I would have gotten superior photographs? Absolutely not. But that all depends on the photographer, he or she themselves, as well as their knowledge and understanding of the photographic tool that they are using. In addition to that, so bear in mind, even though this does 24 frames per second, half of those 24 frames could be trash. So you have to keep that in mind. And also, you're not getting all of the photographic detail you are with the A7R Mark III, which means even though this is more flexible, literally, it's not when it comes to, of course, the sensor that's under the hood. Both of these do slow motion as well as 4K video capture, which is definitely a nice thing, 120 frames at 1080p with the A7R Mark III. with the cyber shot, they boast up to 960 frames per second, but of course that's not truly in 1080p. You're really going to stick to the 240 mark. Anything higher than that and the image degradation is too significant. So something noteworthy. I do love that we have an onboard display that will give you, relevant information to all the different settings and battery life, the number of shots available still that you're working with your SD card on camera. I wish that was something incorporated into the A7R or any of Sony's mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras, but they simply don't have the space on the footprint. As much as Sony has continued to enlarge their bodies, an onboard screen like that simply isn't part of the game. Another thing I want to point out that I think is really important on the video side of things, and this again speaks to convenience, beyond having to swap lenses, is that having a power zoom lens on this camera, on the RX10 Mark IV, definitely makes it better in many ways for video than the A7R Mark III. And that's because you do have a 35 millimeter equivalent of 24 to 600 millimeters without having to turn anything to zoom, and have really, you have speed control settings on that zoom, which equate to giving you style and flexibility in what you capture and how you compose your video that you simply cannot do with an interchangeable lens camera. So that's an inherent advantage that goes to the RX10 Mark IV. You can see very different in terms of design, customization. You do have a C1, C2. I mentioned the onboard flash that you have here. Both have a hot shoe. In terms of the mode dial, right here on the Mark IV, you can see that you do not have the three different programmable presets that you can customize like you have with the A7R Mark III. Again, speaking to the pro as opposed to the run and gun shooter that the Mark IV, the RX10 Mark IV, is really appealing to. The other thing I want to speak to is the cost associated with getting yourself involved in either one of these cameras. Here on the right, $1,700 plus some extra batteries, your SD cards, you're done. Not to say that you wouldn't want other accessories. You have a hot shoe. You have the ability to use that clean HDMI output for, an external display. You do have, microphone and a headphone jack. So you can, of course, blow up your budget a little bit more, get a dedicated battery charger since this does not come with one. Sony expects you to charge the W series battery on board, so I highly recommend that. But if we were to try to get the A7R Mark III to give us the range of this 24 to 600, I almost said 1600, that would be amazing, wouldn't it? 600 mil lens, that's where things become incredibly expensive, and you'll see why. I'm bringing them into frame right now. As I back up the A7R Mark II and the RX10 Mark IV, you can see I've pulled out the Zeiss F4 24 to 70 mil lens. Now this is still well over $1,000. You can probably find one used or gray market for around $1,000, and at that price, it is a very good buy. In spite of how many comparisons have been done to this lens to Sony's own equivalent, which is less expensive, I still think this is a key lens for anyone to have in Sony's full frame lineup. But in order to get yourself to the 600 millimeter reach, you're going to have to purchase something like this, which is the G Master 100 to 400 millimeter lens. And when you factor in this and the Zeiss piece of glass to its left, you are now spending here $2,500 US and here over $1,000. So you're looking at $3,700 just on glass in order to achieve what you have with the RX10 Mark IV already at that $1,700 entry point. Now, do not misunderstand what I just said in any way, shape, or form. The quality that you're going to get with the two lenses that I just busted out, these two, are, the quality is fantastic and does outperform the fixed lens built into the RX10 Mark IV as it should. But by how much? And that is where you as a consumer need to decide where your priorities lie. If you need the absolute best, then of course the interchangeable lens camera on the left is going to deliver that, with the inconvenience of swapping, possibly missing the shot. But that's not to say that the convenience of having this fixed lens with all of its reach and power zoom means you're going to get the shot, because the autofocus system, as good as it is, it's the best that has ever been employed in a bridge style camera, especially with that 24 frames per second, which reminds you of Sony's flagship speed demon, the A9, that shoots 20 frames per second, but of course does so in full frame at $4,500. You aren't going to get the same fidelity because of that 1-inch sensor, and that is a key difference. So even though from a price perspective it may seem very obvious with what I'm saying, that you're spending $3,200 here, then you're going to spend another $3,600 on the glass at least to accomplish similar reach in terms of 35 millimeter equivalent for what the RX10 Mark IV has to offer. Remember, the glass you're spending the additional $3,600 on is superior to what's on here, but that the caveat is convenience, and really what are you doing with these cameras? Because in most of my comparisons, I'll tend to say the A7R Mark III, a camera of this grade, this caliber, is really best suited for professionals who earn their living with their photographic tool. But I can say that about the RX10 Mark IV as well, because after all, what made the RX10 itself so popular is that it was perfect for photojournalists, run and gun style shooting where you needed the best of both worlds. And the RX10 Mark IV delivers that in a way that no bridge style camera has ever done. And that's why I can actually, I would say, safely compare these two cameras, because again, you're going to have to invest more than the price of entry for the A7R Mark III body in order to, again, accomplish this range. Now, the speed is a great thing that both of these cameras have. I think the Achilles of the RX10 Mark IV, though, lies in its lack of 5-axis image stabilization, and that's likely something we'll see in the Mark V, because the RX10 series is not going away. It's popular for a reason. No one else, Panasonic, really the only competing product, still doesn't really compete with what we're looking at here today. And maybe eventually we will have something that will step up to the plate from a manufacturer and actually pose a threat. Another thing I wanted to point out, again, and this is, I kind of pointed this out already, but I will yet again, is the orientation, the style of the actual back end, the backside of these cameras, because they are very similar even though they are in completely different classes. And I say that because I always wondered why Sony had the video button in the correct place on the RX10 but not on any of their mirrorless interchangeable lens cameras. And then they realized that, and so they did something about it. And that was critical to making the RX10 Mark IV great for video, because that thumb style video record button that Sony used to employ really was a nuisance that actually turned a lot of consumers off. I wasn't one of them, but I certainly was not in love with it either. But the Wi-Fi and NFC are both here. Play memories no longer exists on either of these cameras, unfortunately. Marketing on the box says Play Memories Home. That's because that's for your desktop PC, not for the camera itself. So you don't have time-lapse apps, a lot of the other applications that were, I'll call nifty, even though that's an old-timey sort of word. You don't have it, and I would like to see it on both of these cameras. Initially, I thought that it was incorporated into the RX10 Mark IV, but it isn't, which is disappointing because it is still a cyber shot. It is still supposed to be directed at consumers, prosumers, not professionals. I understand omitting it, even though I don't like it, from a professional grade camera. I don't really understand omitting it from the RX10 Mark IV, which is still supposed to have a broader appeal, because the RX10 Mark IV is the type of camera that even if you are a professional and own something like the A7R Mark III, this could be a fantastic B camera. a great complement to having a full frame camera. I mean, if there was one camera I had to pick to travel with to complement this brand new $3,200 body, it would be the RX10 Mark IV, because even though the A7R Mark III is fantastic, I don't necessarily want to travel with this Gigunda. So if you don't want to take this on a trip with you, then obviously it's a lot easier to bring something like this, bring something like the 55mm prime FE lens, or my good old favorite, the Zeiss 16-35, and then you've got 3 different lenses that give you a broad range. And if you really need telephoto, rather than bringing along a lens that actually weighs more than the RX10 Mark IV, you have a whole nother camera to work with, and really another level of flexibility, as I keep mentioning, because both of these cameras are about giving you the best of both still and video. But of course, the sensor and the professional grade features and the build quality that the A7R Mark III is comprised of outclasses everything on the market. So you can't expect the RX10 Mark IV to step up to that plate. But because it does have customizable buttons, because it does have that hybrid autofocus system, because it does have a very fast autofocus, although not the most accurate, especially in this comparison, not nearly as accurate as the A7R Mark III, and it doesn't have the image stabilization. It has traditional, steady shot, which is better than nothing. But when you get out to, I would say, beyond 300 millimeters, you're going to need something to brace or stabilize, whether it's a monopod, tripod, or something to put it down on. It really becomes a matter of, again, that flexibility and which you would find better to travel with and shoot with for your needs. And I could easily see a wedding photographer having this as their A and having this as their B. Of course, in a perfect world, a wedding photographer would just have a couple of these, or an A6500, but again, that results in possibly missing shots because of having to swap lenses, and that's the beauty of the RX10 Mark IV. You're not going to run into that because you've got your entire range right here. Battery life, of course, is a pitfall. I mean, battery life and the 5-axis image stabilization not being here are the biggest pitfalls. Not even the 1-inch sensor, because again, unless you're going to crop 100%, generally the majority of the keepers that come out of this camera look phenomenal. That's until you go to 100% crop. That's when they begin to look like, a watercolor painting, smudges. A7R Mark III, you're dealing with so much more photographic information. The dynamic range, totally incomparable, not comparable to that of what you can get out of this 1-inch sensor. So that does put it in a completely different class, much like the professional features that I've mentioned that pros require. It's not that they want them. They need the better battery life. They need the dual SD card slots. They need Type-C charging and file transfer, even though I always just use an SD card reader. These are things that professionals expect. But if I had to choose between these two cameras as a hobbyist enthusiast, I would have to push people towards the RX10 Mark IV, simply because, again, it is an all-in-one package, and it comes in at a price that's less than the glass, which is actually more expensive, as I've already noted in the course of this video, that you'd have to purchase for the A7R, which is already $3,200 on its own, in order to achieve not the same level of flexibility, but the same range of focal flexibility. So this is all about cost, flexibility, convenience. Do you want to carry a bag of lenses? Do you want to carry a gear bag, really? Because if you're traveling with the RX10 Mark IV on its own, a gear bag is not necessary. You can just bring it, and that's it. The A7R Mark III, on the other hand, the complete opposite. Both are fantastic cameras, both complement each other, but ultimately this is about budget and what you plan on doing with it. If you're a pro, the A7R Mark III is definitely the right camera for you, but hey, even if you're a pro, the RX10 Mark IV may be the right camera for you. And that's why this video was important for me to share with all of you. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe. Later.